you're unmute, that's just fine. I just want to wait for the 2 or 3 people that are still alive. If you don't mind, is that okay?
Yeah. And if anyone has questions, we're a small group.
Yeah. So
I'm the only one in the mask.
how we roll. So we.
I think we should stand there using.
I don't need it, but I have to click the button. Yeah, I'll wait for Brad.
Testing, testing. Okay.
I think I will, do you
Well,
want me to use the
because-
microphone?
well,
All right.
People on the Zoom will have to.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Those of you watching from home and those of you who are here, we are so delighted to have you here at Holy Comforter. My name is Ann Gillespie, and I am the Senior Associate Rector and the Director of the Center for Wellness and Spirituality here at Holy Comforter. And on behalf of myself and all of the leadership and all of the people here at Holy Comforter, we're just thrilled that you can be part of this tonight. And it is coming to the end of the Liberty Amendments Month in Vienna, and we've been very proud of our offerings from Holy Comforter. We were so happy and that we could host 70 people for an outdoor concert put on by members of Halo Inc. And really thrilled that we get to hear from Winifred Conkling tonight. Winifred has been a parishioner for 25 years, but in her life outside, and she volunteers for everything. Oh, do come in. It's so good to see you. Welcome. And Winifred is volunteers in many capacities here, which is kind of wonderful. But in her life outside Holy Comforter, she is an author of more than 40 books, both fiction and nonfiction, and am I right, young adult and adult and children, all of the above. And but her favorite passion is what she calls narrative nonfiction, so historical fiction that all of the history is accurate, but gives you a sense of being alive and in it at the time. So without further ado, on this very important subject, I'm glad to see so many women here tonight and a few men. Let's explore women's suffrage and welcome Winifred.
Thank you, Anne. And I appreciate the chance to be here tonight and to talk about the 19th Amendment. And I think it's really terrific that the town of Vienna has sponsored this month of the Liberty Amendments, and hope people have had a chance to take advantage of other parts of the program. And we're a small group, fairly small group. And so if anyone has questions while I'm going along, we'll leave time at the end. But if while I'm presenting, if you just want to interject, that is fine too. So I am Winifred Conkling, the author of Votes for Women. And if you've seen the purple cover too, that's because when publishers introduce a paperback version, they often have a slightly restyled cover. So the purple cover and the red cover are both for the same book. And our story, and we're not advancing. Yes. Let me try the other one. Nope. So I'm hitting that one, right?
All right.
Oh, There we go.
Could use the
Which ones?
left, right,
I tried
whichever.
that. Okay, so let me try it again. Oh, well, here we are. So our story this evening is going to begin back in 1848, 170 years ago. And just to get a little bit of perspective here, at the time, slavery was legal. Women were expected to work in the home, and women did not have any of the same rights that they do today. So married women actually had even fewer rights than single women. Women had to do what their father said, and when they got married, they had to do what their husband said. So how does that sound? We've got some younger people here. Yeah, it doesn't make it too appealing, does it? Women were not allowed to own property. So that purse, that belongs to your dad or to your husband, okay? Everything, any jewelry could be taken from your husband or the man in your life. Women were not allowed to sign contracts. They could not do business. They could work, but any money they made belonged to either their husbands or their fathers. Women could be beaten by their husbands as long as the whip was no bigger than the thumb. So look at your thumb and imagine being struck with something that thick. Women could not go to college. They could not testify in court. They were expected to be quiet in public. So this meeting would be considered, because we have both men and women in the audience, this is a promiscuous gathering. And for a woman to address a promiscuous group was considered an outrage. So no talking either. Women, of course, did not have the right to vote. And of all of these injustices, most women considered the most important issue suffrage. Because if women had the right to vote, they could vote to change all these other injustices. So it's an important reminder that the right to vote is the source of power in any democracy. True in 1848, still true today. Voting is where your power comes from. So we're going to focus on a couple of women tonight. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's the first woman I kind of want to start with. When she was growing up, she had 5 brothers. She also had some sisters, but the 5 brothers are the ones that matter, right? Because the male heir was the one who received all of the assets of the family. And all of those 5 brothers died, all 5. Her father had been a wealthy lawyer and he was well connected politically, and he really wanted to pass his estate on to a male heir. And all he had was Elizabeth and the sisters. So she was 11 years old when at the time her brother, who was 20 years old, came home from college. He had just graduated from Union College. And he woke up in the morning and he had a cough. 12 hours later, he was dead. And her father, he was the last surviving male heir. So her father was like completely distraught. And Elizabeth tried to comfort her dad. So her dad is sitting in a chair and Elizabeth crawled into his lap and she tried to comfort her dad. And she said, and he said in response to her, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." I know, the one thing she could never do is what he asked of her. And she replied, "I will try to be all my brother was." So she tried to kind of raise herself to that challenge, but of course she never really could do it. And, but she went out and she tried to learn, well, she did learn Greek, and she learned how to jump horses over large embankments. She studied her father's legal books, and she read passages that actually indicated some of these injustices against women. And she started to pick up her scissors to cut those passages out, thinking that that would negate the law because it was no longer in the book. Then her dad went and explained to her that that's not how it works. That's just a book. And if you want to change the laws, they lived in New York, you have to go to Albany and you have to change the law, unaware at the time that he was planting a seed in his young daughter's mind. So she actually went on and she finished high school, and a college had just opened up that was available to women. So she, in fact, did get her opportunity to go to college. And in this book, and what I really want to do is focus on how exceptional it is to have a woman like this, because you can look at her, you know, she's an attractive woman from a wealthy family. She's got it. She represents female white privilege of 1848, right? She can have a very comfortable life by following the traditional patterns. And it's really interesting to me, why would you buck the system? Why would you choose to make your life hard when you could have it easier than virtually any other woman in the country? And it was because her father said, if only you were a boy. She spent her life dedicating her entire existence to trying to prove herself worthy. And that kind of backstory, I think, is really helpful to understand not just what these women did, but why they did it. That's her parents. That's actually her husband, and that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And that is a mansion that was owned by her cousin, Garrett Smith. And he was a big progressive at the time. And at his home, he would have a lot of abolitionists and a lot of other, famous people come to the house, and they had stirring conversation, and they kind of got each other fired up about how to make the world better. And when she was there, she heard Henry speaking about abolition, and that is what caused her to fall in love with him. So they ended up getting married. It wasn't easy. Her father didn't approve of the marriage because that's not what she had in mind. This again is supposed to be the next generation of his estate, and he doesn't really want her to marry an abolitionist, right? He wants a lawyer or somebody who has a promising future. So he did not support this marriage, but they ended up getting married anyway. And for their honeymoon, they went to an international anti-slavery conference. And it was actually in England. So it was quite an event. And she went overseas, and actually there were several women who had been, a handful of women, who had been elected to actually serve as representatives of their groups or congregations at this international conference. And one of them was Lucretia Mott. And Lucretia was a good Quaker, and her Quaker church is the one that had nominated her to go. And when they got to this international conference, they said the women would not be recognized. I saw your eyes light up. Isn't that horrible? So the women were not recognized even by this group of forward-looking abolitionists. So Lucretia Mott had a really profound impact on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's life. She was a bit older, and she had already raised her children, and her Quaker values, which represented equality of the races, as well as equality by gender. The Quakers believe there is a light inside you, and your light shines, and your job is to kind of let your light shine and do good works. So at the time, at this conference, they pledged to themselves that when they got back to the States, they would hold a conference, a women's conference. That ultimately became the Seneca Fall Women's Rights Convention, but that conference did not happen right away. It was about 7 years because Elizabeth Cady Stanton was having children, Lucretia Mott, it was hard for them to get together. But they finally did 7 years later, in 1848. There were 5 women, and they met for tea in Seneca Falls. And they said, this is it. This is the time. We've got to start this convention. We've got to go ahead and hold the meeting. And that text on the right-hand side is the actual text that they ran in a newspaper. And it was only a few days before the actual convention. And they thought that nobody was going to show up. They assumed nobody was going to show up. But when the actual date came along, more than 300 people showed up. And those were both men and women. And the women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had drafted a document called.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
In terms of, were there any people of color that showed up? Was it all white?
It was not all white.
Okay.
Yeah.
You published that.
Frederick Douglass was, in fact, they created this document that was called modeled on the Declaration of Independence, and it was called the Declaration of Sentiments. And instead of saying all men are created equal, they rewrote it. All men and women are created equal. And they drafted a series of sentiments, things that they wanted to accomplish. And even among these women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was pushing for suffrage, right? The right to vote, that essential piece. Every other woman on that board was hesitant because they said, we'll be a laughing stock. No one's going to take us seriously if we go ahead and ask for suffrage. That's too far. But she convinced them to put it in. And then the group, those 300 people in attendance, they voted one by one, which they would approve. And there was a debate about whether or not suffrage should even be on this platform. And it was, in fact, Frederick Douglass who stood up and argued in favor of suffrage, because Frederick Douglass knew that the power in a democracy came from the right to vote. And actually, in doing the research for the book, we were able to go to Seneca Falls, and the building is still there. It's part of the National Park Service. So you can actually go into the actual venue where the chapel, where the convention took place. So we talked about Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony. So in 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met another really important person in her life, also a Quaker. And Susan B. Anthony had been a teacher, and she had been very dedicated to temperance for resisting or fighting against alcohol. There were a lot of issues with alcohol abuse, and which led directly to issues of domestic violence. And so a lot of women were both involved with abolition, ending slavery, and temperance, ending access to alcohol. So that is Susan B. Anthony. And then they became a duo. The two teamed up, and they ended up working for the rest of their lives in partnership on the issue of women's suffrage. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the intellectual. She had like 7 kids. So she was home and very distracted with all of her family. And Susan B. Anthony didn't marry and did not have any children. And Susan B. Anthony would often write the speeches, and Anthony would deliver them. And they described this, everything was always so poetic. It was, Stanton described this, she forged the lightning bolts and Anthony threw them. Which I just kind of love the way that, and that was kind of the truth of the matter. They made a very powerful combination that probably neither one of them could have been successful without the other. So during the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement basically took a break. They decided that the world was in chaos, well, their world was in chaos, and that it was not appropriate for the women to be dedicating themselves to suffrage. So instead of focusing on suffrage, they cut and rolled bandages, and they worked with the Red Cross, and they were focused on the Civil War concerns. And then after the war, the entire women's movement, and that's a lot of the stuff we've been learning about this month, our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And there was a divide over those issues within the women's movement. So one group, which was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they wanted universal suffrage. Suffrage for African Americans, suffrage for females, suffrage for everybody. And a lot of the other people basically said, we can only incrementalism, right? We can only get so much that we ask for. And so they thought enough reform, we're not going to get everything that we're asking for. And so the phrase that was often used was, this is the Negro's hour. And they basically said, women, stand back, your turn will come, but this is not your moment. And most women in the suffrage movement went with it. You know, they were okay with that, basically saying, okay, I understand that argument. But Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not. They actually wanted universal suffrage, but they did not want to wait to allow African Americans to go first. So unfortunately, they made a few what today we would consider very poor decisions. Revolution, they really wanted a newspaper. The newspaper was the way that you could communicate your ideas within community, and they did not have the money to get a newspaper. And George Francis Train was a really rich bigot. I mean, that's kind of a hideous bigot. And he basically offered to give them the money to start their newspaper, but they're now aligning themselves with someone who represented some pretty distasteful values. And they went ahead and they accepted the money and they started their newspaper. And in turn, if you do additional research, you will see that they had some pretty horrendous bigoted statements that were made about African Americans receiving the right to vote before affluent white women. And, you know, I think not only is this history, and therefore, in my opinion, it should be taught and recognized, including to children, especially to children. But I think it also is important that everybody, and again, especially children, learn to recognize that the people they may hold up with a lot of respect for the good works that they do are also human, and they're also flawed, and they also make mistakes in judgment. And I think not only is that a truer history, but I think it also allows us to appreciate that we're all a combination of good and evil. We're all flawed. And then maybe we can all feel motivated, even though we are flawed, to try to do good works. So there became a split, even within a fairly small group of the female suffrage movement. So they made two groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and that was led by Stanton and Anthony. And then there was the American Women's Suffrage Movement, which was led by Lucy Stone, and she's the one on the end. She's also Quaker. And the big issue was the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, again, the one that allowed African Americans to vote, because the 15th Amendment is the first time the word men is explicitly used to exclude women in the Constitution. So they recognized that by passing the 15th Amendment, you were not only giving the right of suffrage to African Americans, you were de facto denying it from, it gave citizenship rights, but the word men was used. So many people saw that as an explicit exclusion of women. And Stanton said, it'll be another 50 years before women get the right to vote. And she was right. So Susan B. Anthony tried to do something a little bit clever. In 1872, she and a group of 14 women went to the polls and voted for president. She basically said, if the 15th Amendment is giving the vote to citizens, I'm a citizen, right? I have the right to go vote. And she wanted to get arrested and she wanted to go to court. And she got her wish. She was arrested in her home and she went to court, and ultimately the judge The judge had written his decision already, had it in his pocket. So didn't really matter a whole lot what he had to say. It was predetermined that he was going to vote that she did not have the rights of citizenship. And in fact, that document said, at one point, the judge said, Miss Anthony, you are not a citizen. So women are now denied, explicitly denied the rights of citizenship. And this judge said, do you have anything to say before being sentenced? And Anthony, a very articulate woman, stood and she started lecturing the judge. Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say. For your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government, my natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights. She went on and on and on. And the judge kind of had to give her the hook and say, sit down. And then you can actually read the entire transcript. It's now available online. And if anybody's a teacher, I think it would be a great fun to have it performed as a skit using the actual words that they use, because it's almost like it's farcical, because she sits down and she goes on, he tries to shut her up and get her to sit down, and it's a back and forth thing. But in the end, he fines her $100. And what's she gonna do? She refuses to pay the fine, hoping to go to jail, hoping to then be able to appeal to the Supreme Court. So, today we hear a lot about legislating from the bench and having courts decide certain issues rather than passing laws. This is not new. This is what Susan B. Anthony was trying to do back in 1872. So she refused to pay her fine, hoped to go to jail. Her attorney could not bear the thought of such a lovely woman going to jail. So he went ahead against her wishes and paid the fine for her. Oh, I know, she doesn't even have the right to stand on her own principles. So he paid it. I mean, he meant well, and she recognized that he meant well, but she used this as a great opportunity for PR. And she spoke for decades. This woman spoke all across the country. And every time after this event, she would open her speeches with, I stand before you as a convicted criminal. This became her opportunity to then tell her story. And she just kept on with her women's rights work. So our two groups, the National Women's Suffrage, they were working to get a single amendment passed to the Constitution so that all women all over the country would have the right to vote. The American Women's Suffrage Association said, let's kind of peck on this bit by bit, and we'll do it state by state. It's the same issues we're fighting today. So they said, let's get different states to allow women to vote. And so by the end of this century, there were still they'd only wanted 4 states, the dark blue ones, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, the dark blue ones. They gave women the right to vote. And a lot of these you can see are like Western territorial states where they tried to create incentives for women to come from the East. And suffrage was one thing they did to kind of lure women as something that might be appealing to them. So in 1890, the two women's groups got back together again. It had been almost 20 years and neither side was frankly very effective.
Explain what partial suffrage.
Partial suffrage might be, you can vote in the school board election because you have children, but you can't vote for state office or for president. So certain states were giving, the rights to vote in certain primarily local issues, but that women still did not have the right to vote in national or statewide
Full
elections.
suffrage meant they could vote for president.
Pardon?
Full suffrage meant they could vote for president.
Correct.
And the vote would be counted, right?
Right. Yep. That so what they were striving for and what our women suffragists were striving for was frankly suffrage in any way, but they wanted federal suffrage too. And you would think that the primary opponent would be men, but there were a lot of women who also were very active in the anti-suffrage movement, and not every woman wanted the right to vote. So there were some women who said, I am already represented by my father, who can take my money, and my husband, and I don't need the right to vote. And it was considered a big burden to have to go to the polls. And some women did not want to give away their protected status. They had, certain protections as women, and they were fearful that if they had the right to vote, they would start to be treated without the same protective status. And just like we have today, we use propaganda, right? So there was a massive wave of anti-suffrage propaganda, so that the women who want to vote are portrayed as bad mothers, right? And they are bad wives, and they're ugly, right? And they're unfeminine. And, think about the 1960s. What were the women's movement in the 1960s? You're ugly if you're a feminist, you're a bra burning, you're promiscuous, you're a lesbian, any negative connotations you could try to, perceived as negative at the time, you could try to impose on someone. It's the same way of alienating and otherizing people who are part of these reform movements. They also want to go to that issue of emasculated men, right? So you're going to want to say any man, because who's voting, right? Men are the ones who have the right to vote. It's very emasculating. You're going to let your wife vote? But I think the propaganda, and it's really fun if you ever want to Google them and look them up, because that's just a tiny sampling, and they're really quite interesting. Then as we're getting to the end of the century, Stanton and Anthony are now quite old, and they have to hand the leadership of the suffrage movement. They haven't met their goal. They've dedicated 50 years of their lives to something that still hasn't happened, and they are still doing it every single day. And Stanton died in 1902, and Anthony died in 1906. And the next wave of the suffrage movement had to come along. And those women, we're going to kind of go fast over most of them. We've got Carrie Chapman Catt. These are names you may or may not recognize. Anna Howard Shaw. They were organizational leaders. Harriet Eaton Stanton Blatch, and she was in fact Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. So it's kind of nice to see, the feminism of the next generation, right? And Alice Paul. Yeah, I saw that. I love it. I love Alice Paul too. And in fact, when I was writing this book, I would force my children to listen to me at the dinner table. And I'd say, who wants to know what pesky Alice Paul did today? So Alice Paul, who is a fascinating figure. When she was 23, she was also a Quaker. She went to Swarthmore College, which was a Quaker founded school. And when she was 23, she was studying social work, an acceptable female profession. And she went to spend time in England at a research institution there. And while she was there, she was exposed to the British suffragettes. And the suffragettes are British, the suffragists are the American version. And they are supporting, well, the only real distinction is the British version. They were not violent, but they did use some violence to get attention. They did break windows with bricks. They did have some explosions. Nobody was injured, but they, would sometimes set bombs off in garbage cans, and there was a little bit of property destruction. And the American wing had this strong Quaker pacifist influence, and they did not support the use of any violence. So there is a real distinction between the movements, but people often call Americans suffragettes. And it's really an interesting aside. But anyway, Alice Paul, she did work with the suffragettes in the UK. And when she came back to the United States, she became a leader in the movement. And her idea, which was considered really radical at the time, was to have a parade. And when you think about it, why would you have a parade? For media attention. Even though you don't have the internet, you have newspapers, right? So you want to get a story out there and you want to have broad coverage. So she created this beautiful parade, and she had women from every state. She had them marching in, they all wore long gowns and they had different colored sashes, and it was a spectacle. And she arranged to have this parade the day before Wilson was to be inaugurated. So there was a little bit of, you're gonna notice us now, a little foreshadowing of what was about to come. So she created this parade, and she was very successful in getting a lot of media attention. And there were a lot of men in town for the inauguration, and they drank all day, the day before, and they're lining the streets and they're harassing these women. And they actually blocked the entire parade route, and they would grab their hats and spit on the women and harass them. And there were some injuries, not of the women, but of the men brawling around on the sidelines, kind of as part of this big mess. And she initially, oh, my parade is a mess, but she was delighted because it meant she got even more press coverage. And she was savvy by bringing in women from different groups, because each of those groups would say, the Maryland women who were in the parade, and then, the Georgia women who were in the parade. So she got more press coverage by being very conscientious about how to bring different groups together. And she used that later again. So it may, by today's standard, we don't think a parade is a big deal, but it was a revolutionary idea at the time. As was the Silent Sentinels. So we think protests, we might think today, you younger people probably are thinking Black Lives Matter, yeah, right? Then older people may think of Vietnam, 1960s. But the first protest was Alice Paul and the Silent Sentinels. And the Silent Sentinels, you can see they are middle class and upper class women. They're nicely dressed in their long coats, and they have sashes on, and they are carrying banners. And the first time they went out, they had a banner that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And the second banner said, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And this was considered radical. They stood outside the gates to the White House, silently carrying these banners. And Wilson came in and had no idea what to do with these women. So he invited them in for tea. So the women said, "We are really not here for tea." And they politely declined and continued to hold their banners. And Wilson assumed this was over. And Wilson was wrong, because the next day they came back again with different banners, with slightly different messages. And they came again and again and again. And they showed up when it was raining, and it was hot, and it was cold. It was really, really cold. They heated bricks, and they stood on top of bricks so the heat would get trapped under their skirts and their feet would stay warm. And I think I really like the consistency of this idea of showing up day after day. And I've often fantasized about a current social movement, particularly involving guns, frankly, and some of the killings, where if you could have young people standing there with banners silently, with just the faces and names of people who have been killed in school violence, just how stirring that would be. And you just line the stairs of Congress every day. They just don't go away. that is just like a haunting reminder. And you become the conscience of a movement. And that's what these women understood. And they stayed there again and again, you know, day after day. And then they started getting a little feisty. They started spicing up their messages and targeting more at Wilson himself. And basically Wilson thought, I know how to shut these women up. I'm going to threaten to arrest them. So he arrested the first batch of women for blocking the sidewalk, and he threw them in the workhouse. So they actually also in the DC jail, which was a horrible place, and the workhouse, which was also a horrible place, which is right near us. It's down 123. It's currently the Lorton Workhouse Art Center. It's where it used to be a prison, and it's where these women were taken. And actually, if you ever go there, they've recently developed a really wonderful exhibit that focuses on what happened there and how it helped the suffragists. So they showed up again in the cold and the rain with their signs. And then these women were held in the workhouse. And the prison conditions were really very harsh. Their blankets were washed once a year. They drank from cups, dirty water from cups, where they all dipped it in the same pail. They had scratchy uniforms, and their shoes were one size fits all and no right or left. So they were really not much. They did not have toothbrushes, combs, or toilet paper. The food was disgusting. A typical diet would be raw salt pork, bread, and watery soup. And there were worms in the beans and the rice and the cornmeal. And they document how at one point the tables where the women ate thought it would be fun to have a competition, counting how many worms they could find in their food. And when they got to 15, they were so disgusted they stopped eating. And in turn, Alice Paul said, got to do something about this. And she proposed a hunger strike. This was also not original. This had also been done in England. She and other strikers, hunger strikers, were pinned down and they were force-fed milk and raw eggs. And they put tubes, forced tubes down their throats and poured it through a funnel. And if a woman clenched her jaw shut so that you couldn't put a tube in, they shoved it up their noses. The prison warden thought he could weaken these women, so he ordered the cooks to fry bacon 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day to get them really, really hungry. And none of the women succumbed. They all stuck to their hunger strike. Alice Paul was a tiny little woman. You may remember from the earlier photograph, maybe she weighed 100 pounds. She was not one who could tolerate a hunger strike very long. So they were really terrified she was going to die and be a martyr for the cause. They really didn't want her to die. So they decided any woman willing to go through this must be crazy. So they put her in a psychiatric ward. So they took Alice Paul, so she is now in isolation, not eating, not complying, because again, it used to be fairly easy to have women committed when they did not obey the wishes of their husbands and fathers. So she's put off in a psychiatric ward and cannot communicate with anybody. And she ends up, and she couldn't even talk to her lawyer. So she ends up writing notes about what is happening. And a sympathetic guard smuggled the note out and was able to get that note to her attorney, who then went before a judge and said, this is what's going on. the judge called the women to court, and he saw that these women, who frankly were white, they were middle class and upper class, and could have been his neighbors and his wife's best friends, right? So he ordered him to seize these women, and they are starving to death, and they are beaten, and they are just distraught. And he orders that they all go home. And in the meantime, Wilson is like just at odds because he has not won this battle because they have been consistent and staying in sticking to their message. So when word got out, the women were finally released. Those are some of the women as they got to, who were protesting. The protests continued throughout this. It did not stop. Did not stop when the women were arrested. Did not stop with the hunger strikes. They kept at it. And finally, President Wilson got the message and he decided that he should tell Congress to support the 19th Amendment. He did this partially because he was losing the PR battle at home. He also framed it around the issue that World War I was just ending. And at the end of World War I, you kind of reflect on the fact that women worked throughout. Women were the powerhouse behind the war effort, not exclusively, obviously, but they played a significant role in the US involvement in supporting the economy and working in factories. So he said that since the women proved their mettle through their contributions during World War I, we should reward them with the vote. So he in fact made a speech and he encouraged Congress to pass, and they had voted on this forever, for decades, but it finally passed with Wilson's explicit support for it in 1919. But then, as you know from civics class, once a constitutional amendment is passed, it must still be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So at that time in 1919, that meant 36 states had to pass it. And some passed it right away. Sometimes it was a struggle. They got 35 states. They needed one more, and that one was Tennessee. And it all came down in 1920 in a ratification effort to the vote, and the Tennessee Senate passed it. And it came down to the Tennessee House of Representatives. And everybody came to Nashville. They were all in this Hermitage Hotel, and their pros and con people are right next to each other. And frankly, the liquor lobby was very much involved in trying to overcome suffrage because they knew that if women got the right to vote, they were going to interfere with alcohol. And so they were very concerned about it and very anti-suffrage. And the legislators wore roses, yellow roses or red roses, indicating whether they were for or against. And everybody is counting votes, counting roses to try to figure out, and it looked really, really close. So they finally called for the vote, and it was tied, 48-48. And so the anti-suffrage folks said, okay, this is it. We can call for the vote, and since it's tied, it won't pass, and it'll be tabled till the next time, and no one can vote in the next, it won't pass now. And the presidential election in 1920, women won't stop it. So they went ahead and they called for the vote, but they did not know, right up there is a photograph of Harry Byrne. And Harry Byrne was from this small town, and he was the youngest legislator there. And they didn't know that that morning he had received a letter from his mother. That's the letter addressed to him. And he was planning on voting no, and unless they called for the actual vote, and then he was going to change his vote to yes because his mother told him to. And his mother told him to because, and he knew his mother read like 3 newspapers every day. That's Feb Byrne. She's the woman in the first image. And he really respected his mother's intellect, and he knew his mother deserved the right to vote. So his heart told him he supported it. His politics told him to vote against it. But when it came to that critical moment, he went with what he believed to be true, even though he never expected to be reelected after taking this vote. But he changed his vote and he voted yes. And therefore, Tennessee went all because of one vote. So if you ever say my vote does not matter, you think of Harry Byrne, because it does. So he changed his vote, and suffrage had now been ratified, not in Tennessee, but all across the country. And that is Charlotte Woodward. And in 1920, she was allowed to vote in the presidential election. And she is the only surviving person who had been at age 19 at the 1848 convention. And she survived to see suffrage come to fruition, but unfortunately, she was sick and unable to go to the polls and did not get to cast her ballot. But she did just live to see the dream realized. So anyway, poor Charlotte. So some people may wonder about the League of Women Voters. So if you don't know what the League of Women Voters, it's a nonpartisan, a political group that tries to provide information so that people on both sides, and that is a direct descendant, rather than disbanding the American, they became, when they combined it, even worse name, the National American Women Suffrage Association, put them all in there. And that group, after women gained the right to vote, became the League of Women Voters. So again, striving not to represent any politics, but rather to encourage suffrage for all, you know, information so that you can cast your vote wisely. And this is one of my favorites. I voted today because of her. And every year when people vote, they go to the grave marker of Susan B. Anthony and they put their I voted stickers on her home and her grave in Rochester, New York. So I encourage everyone to vote in every election, your local, your state, you know, your federal elections. I would also encourage, we've started to experience a lot of backlash, particularly in the last few years in terms of access to voting for African Americans and other minority groups. And we can do something about that, right? We need to empower ourselves to take advantage of our own suffrage, but we also need to be cognizant of efforts that are being made today. This is not history, this is current history, to limit access to voting by other groups. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Virginia is doing certainly much better than it used to, but things like needing to show ID and restrictions on number of voting places, the hours of operation. There are a lot of ways we don't, you know, they're 21st century Jim Crow. And it's alive and well. We think of all of these issues as being distant past, and they are still with us in a different outfit, different issues. But not only should we exercise our own right to vote, but I believe we should all also become involved in defending the voting rights of others. And I would love to take any questions. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
When men voted, did they ever take their wife's opinion?
Oh, that's a great question. When men voted, did they ever discuss the matter and listen to their wives' opinions? And I hope the answer to that is yes.
Smart ones did.
The smart ones did. So I think it probably depends on household to household. John Adams did. John Adams, Remember the Ladies was his wife, Abigail, wrote to her husband, second president, and said, remember the ladies. Although women did not, of course, have the right to vote till a century plus later. That's a great question, though. And it probably, some families may have discussed politics, and probably a lot of men thought it was up to them to decide what was best for their families, and they didn't want to hear what their wives said. And there were probably some women who were very opinionated and may have let everybody know what their beliefs were, regardless of whether their husband asked. But I think that's probably on a family by family basis. Any other questions?
So I've heard that, I thought it was at the Seneca Falls Convention that Sojourner Truth spoke. Was that not accurate?
After this 1848 convention, there were other ones.
Okay.
And she spoke actually in Ohio, I'm pretty sure it was, and it was a few years later. But that was a very stirring moment where Sojourner Truth, who was 6 feet tall, an African-American former slave, and she marched in, well, she was in the back listening, and then she came forward and asked if she could address this women's rights convention. And they weren't sure what to do, and they said yes. And that's when she made her very famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And anybody not familiar with the "Ain't I a Woman" speech, I would strongly encourage, when you go home, just listen to, like, I'm sure there are presentations on YouTube, but she basically says, you know, look at my arm, I can plow and I can do this and I can do that. And ain't I a woman? And I do, you know, and then at the end of this speech, it's fantastic. She basically, you know, says all of these physical accomplishments that she's had. And then she says, you know, something that in her, I butcher quotes, but it was basically the idea of Jesus, you talk about your Jesus, but Jesus came from God and a woman. Man didn't have anything to do with it. And that was like the concluding line, but it is absolutely marvelous, and it has often been presented. So I really encourage you to go home and listen to Ain't I a Woman reinterpreted.
As a person who knows a lot about these issues, what is your view of how this is taught in schools, and also how the United States went about marking the centennial? What did you observe? What were your observations?
Well, the centennial, they started out trying to do a lot of programming, and COVID came along. It was last year, was the centennial. And so they had good intentions with a lot of programs that frankly did not take place, or they took place on Zoom with very limited participation. So I think they really did attempt to have programming around it, but due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, they really couldn't do all they had intended. In terms of how suffrage is taught in the schools, I would like to think it's getting a little bit better, but for the most part, I don't think most schools, all our names of our women you went over, most people can come up with Susan B. Anthony because she had the coin, right? And that's pretty much often the end of it. Anybody, I know you knew Alice Paul, but most people don't. And these women are just as dynamic and influential as many men we do study, know about. So not to take away from learning the history of our men, but we do need to learn the history of our women. So I wish people did a better job. And I am strongly in favor of teaching all parts of history, the ugly parts of history, of slavery, of the way we've abused people since the beginning, and denied the rights to women. This is our history, and the only way we can become a better people and a better nation is to explore it, accept it, and learn from it so that we can move forward. Ignorance is not the answer. in terms of women's history or anybody else's history either, in my opinion.
One of the things that impresses me is how long it took and the staying of these people to go on and on and on. And I think that because we live in a society that wants everything to work, and history shows us that it just doesn't work that way. It just takes very often very, very long time.
Well, and look at civil rights. I would say we're not done there either. And yet, I mean, that's from our country's founding too. And I think a lot of social change happened slowly. And I, again, didn't really recognize or honor the incrementalist approach, because for the most part, sometimes you just have to put it out there and make change. But on the other hand, I have to say, I believe our country made very fast progress when it came to homosexual rights. You know, that's not exactly true. I mean, so long we were not addressing that issue, but once we really took it on, I feel like our country has largely embraced that issue. That came much faster than I would have thought it would as a reform movement. And one of the things I find most interesting on this question of reform goes back to that 15th Amendment, where we ended up taking African Americans and women, as we often do in any progressive movement, and we attempt to divide, create wedge issues, so that, because political groups are stronger when they're unified toward a common goal. So we, as a country, tend in our politics to try to divide groups, to marginalize people in order to make it easier to defeat them and what they're asking for. So that's where, whenever we can come together toward a common goal, I think it's by definition a more powerful movement. Anybody else?
When did women get the vote in England?
When did women get the vote in England? Before we did in the US, but I don't exactly remember.
Okay.
And in fact, people often say, where did you get this idea to do this book? And obviously there's the centennial, but what actually, I had done a previous book that dealt with women physicists, and basically Irene Curie, daughter of Marie. And there was a passing line in this book about how women in France did not get the right to vote until 1945. That is insane. And then, because that seems like yesterday. And then you look, okay, 1945, well, 1920 is really not that far from 1945. And the fact that it's, you know, my grandmother was alive, you know, sometimes the older I get, the less distant 100 years feels. But in general, it just was the blink of an eye. And I think it just really struck me with that Irene Curie going, 1945, that just seemed insane.
Maybe wrong, but I think Switzerland, it was 1971, right? There was something.
Switzerland, 1971, that is, yeah. You know, and I kind of think of Switzerland as being fairly progressive in a lot of ways, no? I don't, oh yeah, okay, you know, you're,
I lived in Switzerland.
yeah, not at all, not with women. Huh. Yeah, 71, that really is yesterday.
I just wanted to say thank you, Winifred. What a delight. Let's just pause for a second and please give you the applause that you deserve. Zara for organizing tonight, and for Randy, without whom we would have our technical capabilities. So thank you all. And also I want to introduce Kevin Crisco and Annabelle Zeller, both of whom are part of Images for Good. So this is a nonprofit that Kevin started that mentors young people in terms of taking photographs.
Perfect.
And so that's like,
Photographs, and then, but more importantly, using their voices. And then recognizing that they have an important gift, which is their point of view, which no one else has.
Mhm.
And thank you for being here, Annabelle. And she doesn't have to struggle to vote. And I have 3 daughters, one of them Annabelle's age, and good luck on them making the fair wages that they deserve.
exactly, yeah.
So the progress is not even close to being
Done, right,
Right. So celebrate and renew the energies for moving forward.
Exactly.
So thank you, please, enjoy, we have some lemonade and, water and, a few sweets. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Check this out.